Welcome, everybody. I just want to say that throughout my entire introduction and everything that follows, you are welcome to get up, get yourself a wine, enjoy a pizza if you wish to order it. If the food at the back doesn't satisfy you, please don't feel obliged to hang on my or anybody else's every word. I am delighted that you're all here. My name is Mark Ledbury. I am the director of the Power Institute at the University of Sydney. And I would first like to acknowledge that the University of Sydney campuses, that we are standing, in fact, on Gadigal land. As you will all know, Redfern plays an enormous and important role in the history, the modern history of Aboriginal people in Australia. But we have to remember, as we teach and learn at the University of Sydney, that a tradition of learning that stretches back 40,000 years underpins everything that Australia is. And while we may be a bit behind paying the rent, I would like to pay my respects and acknowledge and welcome the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, their elders past and present. I also have a million thanks to give for a night like this, which is unusual even within the spectrum of the things that the Power Institute does. I want first to thank Josh Berger, whose ideas and energy really lie behind everything we're doing tonight. I'd like to thank John Watson and the Sydney University Medical School. I'd like to thank Anina Rich and everyone at Macquarie University, all her team who are here. I'd like to thank all my team at the Power Institute, especially Lisa Bell-Thorhagen, our marvellous council member and PhD student who has done so much to keep the impetus of this up, and Isabel Hall-Thorburn at the door, Marnie Williams, Susan Thomas, and everybody who's made this possible from many angles. It's a very exciting place to be. It's wonderful to be off campus, to be honest, and have a drink in our hands and be talking intelligently about ideas among thoughtful, committed, intelligent people whose work crosses many disciplines, from cognitive neuroscience to philosophy to art history. Many of you may not know anything about the Power Institute, though I hope you might. And if you don't, please sign up for our mailing list, and then you will find out more. But we have to remember that the Power Institute, I have an absurd title, which is the Power Professor of Art History. And it sounds like some Marvel supervillain, Professor Power, who invented a terrible machine to melt everyone's minds. But in fact, John Power was a committed, the son of an architectural and medical dynasty, who was a medical man, a medical student at the University of Sydney, then a qualified surgeon, who then gave that all up to explore the universe of art. In doing so, came across an extraordinary range of innovative artists in the 1920s and 30s in London and Paris. And at the height of Europe's darkest hour, 39 to 40, he made a will in which he said, one day I'm going to give money to the University of Sydney so that the ideas that nourished all the people I've been with for the last 20 years might save civilization from the grim and awful. He made the will in 1940 in occupied Jersey. And he said, I want to bring the latest in ideas in the visual arts to Australia. But he didn't say that in an innocent way. His friends were expelled artists who'd come from Germany and lived with him. He knew full well that art was one bulwark against oppression, tyranny, and dictatorship. And that is the spirit in which he gave the University of Sydney the money. And we founded many things with that money. I'm a relative newcomer, but the Power was set up when his bequest was made public in 1962. And as you will know, those of you who live in Sydney, we have, since 1962, there's been the setting up of the Department of Art History at the University of Sydney, but that's only one part of it. The MCA wouldn't exist without the University of Sydney and Power's, because it used to be called, some of you with long memories will know, the Power Gallery of Contemporary Art. There would also not be a substantial and exciting collection of modern art that was essentially purchased on the back of his bequest. But the most important legacy is that Power believed that art had a relevance beyond, teaching the history of art to students of the history of art inside a narrow discipline. He really believed that art had something to say to the whole world, to Australia in particular, and that it mattered. It wasn't froth on the, it wasn't just for rich people to talk about in dinner parties. It was actually really deep and meaningful, mattered to the whole of humanity. And if you now imagine yourself in a cave 60,000 years ago and people are making stencils of their hands, we have to accept that art is fundamental, of one kind or another, is fundamental to the human condition. And just as science is vital to our lives today in all kinds of ways, so the cultural sphere also makes us understand what the hell is going on. So in some ways, that explains what we're all doing here. We are talking amongst wonderful, enthusiastic colleagues across disciplines who are trying to understand how humans work, what makes them tick, and why we should care. So all of that is, a preamble to a night where we're talking about synesthesia. And for many of you will know this, it's a word that comes from two Greek words, sign, together, and aesthesis, which is perception. Literally, it means joined perception. Okay, that's a strange word, but, before it was called synesthesia, it had terms like hyperchromatopsy. That's a not particularly tripping off the tongue one. And later, in the 19th century, it got called phonopsy. In a way, the very lack of definition of what synesthesia might be is part of the history. People have grappled towards an understanding of a very complex phenomenon. If you look on a definition site, you will find that you will hear, and Josh will tell you more, synesthesia is an anomalous blending of the senses in which simulation of one modality simultaneously produces sensation in a different modality. Okay, that's, okay, where do I go when I read something like that? I go to Neuroscience for Kids, which says much more clearly, synesthesia is a condition in which one sense, for example, hearing, is simultaneously perceived as if by one or more additional senses, such as sight. Or another form of synesthesia joins objects such as letters, shapes, numbers, or people's names with a sensory perception such as smell, colour, or flavour. And you will hear in the course of this evening a lot of the research that is trying to investigate this. But what's interesting about it? What does it tell us about our brains, our lives, and our culture? These are the questions, I think, that we want to provoke and ask you to think about this evening. Of course, there's a long and complex history of humankind's understanding of the realms of the senses, so to speak, in a way, where vision, smell, hearing, other senses are heavily charged, with moral, philosophical, allegorical meanings, with senses sort of chase and pursue each other. And, we've seen this in medieval music, people have investigated this. I would say that if you want to sort of understand that realm of the senses, so to speak, you might want to just trip down to the AGNSW, where the Dame à la Licorne, amazing event, by the way, you should all go and see the Lady in the Unicorn tapestries, which are sort of focused on the five senses as in their complex allegorical working out in the visual. So in other words, that's a combination of touch and look that is trying to invoke smell and sound. But in the century I've studied most, the 18th century, we have amazing experiments like Castell's famous thought experiment of the colour harpsichord, which never got built, but which attempted to make an equation between the range, the tones of the musical tones and colours. It seems like humans have an intuition that senses don't perfectly or only inadequately are self-sufficient, that in a way there's a spillover or a correspondence or something that pushes one sense into another. But the thick history of cultural and aesthetic and scientific attempts to come to terms with synesthesia really begins in the second half of the 19th century. And for a cultural historian like me, principally, I suppose, invested in or have written about visual culture, it's really fascinating that let's take, a random year in the 1870s, 1873, we have suddenly Fidelis Nussbaumer's very precocious studies into what might be understood, or his attempt to make the first scientific survey of synesthesia, to create a survey which says, do you feel this too? This was a synesthete who thought, this might be a generalizable experience. It's not some weird thing that I've got and only me. And then at the same time, you have cultural historians and writers and artists investigating this same phenomenon. Walter Pater is writing about the Renaissance. He's looking at Giorgione and he's thinking music. He says, the art to which all art aspires is music somehow. He wants to make art musical. And then you have Rimbaud writing his preface, or the one thing that he successfully published, Un Saison en Enfer, in which he refers to his experiment to make vowels have colours. And then, at the same time, you have Hannah Ray Hudson, same year, 1873, exploring her own number and letter synesthesia through poetry. There was an explosion then at that end of the 19th century moment, which in some ways, with a nod to the great Baudelaire, whose correspondence really linked a synesthetic impulse to a more sort of, if you like, a Platonic one. But from Rimbaud to Edgar Allan Poe to Van Gogh to Gauguin to Kandinsky to Mondrian and the Bauhaus to Nabokov, the Italian futurist, Dada, David Hockney, Duke Ellington, Leonard Bernstein, Billy Joel, Stevie Wonder, there is an astonishing concentration of the people that have, if you like, created our visual and sonic sense of what it is to be modern, were people actively, in one way or another, involved with or tinged by their own synesthetic experience. So which tells me something, which tells me that there is a quest involved in that explosion of the first cultural exploration of synesthesia, which has had a profound effect on the art forms and the music of our century. I mean, for everyone from Olivier Messiaen to Duke Ellington, two absolute gods of the 20th century musical scene, were people actively thinking about how their compositions linked with other worlds beyond them. And taken at its most extreme, you have Rimbaud's famous dictum to get to the unknown by the deregulation of all our senses. Arriver à l'inconnu par le dérèglement de tous les sens. So, in some way, that is a vast quest to somehow unpick what we think as the separateness of things, and in doing so, achieve new forms, new ways of understanding the world. Now, a lot of people, that's in some ways what gives synesthesia a bad rap, because everyone said, oh my God, it's drug-taking theosophists, too much opium, too much LSD, a little bit of, or whatever. But in some senses, we have to take seriously a synesthetic impulse, let's call it, that runs through a great deal of the creativity of the last 150 years. However, it's a challenge, because synesthesia challenges our understanding of perception, of cognition, of the orders of the senses. It asks us to think about the gap between direct and indirect experience, even between what is there and what is not there. It explores sensory deprivation and overfullness, and other topics which are of great interest to scientists, philosophers, and artists. I also want to say, and I will get off in a minute, that synesthesia is in some ways a youthful discipline. We are still at a very early stage of our full understanding of synesthesia and the synesthetic the spectrum that might be understood in the synesthetic realm. I mean, in some ways, I might stand to be corrected by the scientists here, but I think that before the 1990s, people didn't talk much about mirror touch synesthesia. Okay, it's not something that was on the cognitive. I mean, it wasn't discussed much. But now it is. Now there are some estimates that 1%, maybe a bit more than 1% of the population might, in some ways, be affected by mirror touch synesthesia. In other words, we're at the start and we are at the start because of new advances in neuroscience and all of that, of a really exciting passage of understanding. And Anina and Josh are going to be talking to you about precisely this, and I want to make sure that I don't completely talk nonsense and that they do the talking about that. But I also just want to, while we're on the subject of youthful, you know, it is interesting how many young people, children, students, and the young find themselves in a synesthetic moment and are almost embarrassed by it, have been in the past slightly embarrassed to talk about it. Oh, well, I just thought this is kind of weird thing about me. I didn't realize it was a thing. And in a way, there is something, I think, you know, it was speculated in the late 19th century that, you know, about 40% of children have some kind of synesthetic impulse which sort of gets bred out of them, that is in some ways corrected in the course of growing up or something. Now, I think that today's scientists would have a different view of that. But in a way, I want to say that in some senses, we're hearing Rimbaud in our head again. You know what? Rimbaud was the great youthful, rebellious poet in some ways. You know, he had created things at 21 that people, you know, would spend their lifetime trying to get to. But, you know, is synesthesia then something that we might actually enliven and rejuvenate us? There are those now, you know, in very serious ways trying to think, well, is synesthesia useful or helpful? Is it something that we can put to use in our own perceptions of the world, for memory, for cognition, for repairing impaired cognition, for helping people who are losing their memory find ways of rejuvenating it? It's a very fascinating kind of strand. But Josh, who will tell you about it more, is also contemplating people who are sort of, for whom synesthesia isn't the sort of joyful excitement of Rimbaud, but actually a pain in the neck. I can't read these numbers because they're the wrong colour. In a way, we also have to dwell on and think through how we might think synesthesia as an interesting or sort of, in a way, running interference with our lives. And Josh will tell you more about that later. I have a hunch, though, that another of the things that we should do with synesthesia is just think about it in terms of creativity, in terms of the ways that, you know, to be creative at the moment is what everyone wants and no one quite knows how to get to. It's another thing that John Power would have told us to do from the very outset, which is listen to artists, listen to musicians. They have insights that all the TED Talks in the world won't tell you, or all the seminars with CEOs won't tell you. It is a way, for John Power, art was a domain in which great specialists of enormous skill could pass on their understanding of the world about us. I have a sense that in the investigation of synesthesia, we are going to find ways in which humankind can learn to embrace its oddness, can learn to develop new ways of perceiving the world, and can put to use the insights of those felt to be marginal, strange, or weird. That seems to me like an excellent reason why we should all be here talking science and art, talking among researchers who are doing serious, cutting-edge work, from philosophy to cognitive neuroscience, even to art history. Let's hear it for art history, everyone. And that's why we're all here. That's what I hope this evening will help us think about. So I'm going to stop talking now, and I'm finally going to cede the floor to the people you want to hear, the musicians, because we're going to do an experiment to start this. We are going to invite Lachlan Pierce and Tony Gibson up, as well as Nina Nova, as synesthetic artist, and I think to the strains of Johnny Hodges and Duke Ellington, two great synesthetes and jazzmen, Nina is going to attempt to recreate some of that, the response and the synesthetic response which she has felt all through her work while the musicians play. So for the next 15 minutes, you're welcome, obviously, to get up, have a drink. I shall stop talking. I want to thank again all of those people who've made it possible, and take it away, musicians and artists. Thank you very much.
you want another one? I thought you were sitting there to tell me to shut up.
Catch your breath.
You want another song?
Do you want another song? No. One more.
One more, alright.
Catch your breath though.
Catch it. Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. Could I have another round of applause for these amazing musicians in this wonderful art jam? We'll just be taking a 5-minute intermission while we get a microphone for Miss Nina Nova, and then we'll be having a quick question and answer session between herself and the audience about the correspondences between her painting and that wonderful jam session we just heard. So just go to the bar, grab yourself another drink, we'll be back in 5 minutes. Thank you. Now we're going to be having a discussion with Nina Nova about her correspondences between what she heard and then what she saw. I apologise, I should have introduced myself. I'm Joshua Berger. I've also been helping organise tonight. I'll be discussing with Nina what she saw and heard, and then we'll open it up to the audience to ask some questions of her, if you have any questions about the artwork. Isabel will be walking around with the microphone if you want to ask questions, so just raise your hand and she'll bring it over to you. So Nina, I just wanted to get you to disambiguate or distinguish between the trombone and the saxophone.
So trombone is a bit darker sound for me. So the trombone is mainly down here. It's like the more brown and like reds and orange. And then the saxophone is more up with the gold. But they both have a bit of gold and yellow, but it's, yeah, the more darker and more rounder, bolder is the trombone.
And I would assume then the lighter orange is the saxophone?
Yeah, and the green is from the saxophone as well. All the green stuff is... Okay. This is basically the trombone is more here.
Nina,
yeah?
When you're experiencing the colour, is it happening in the centre of your vision?
No, it's around, it's like if I look here, it starts where my sight ends. So it's
your
like
peripheral vision?
Yeah, so it's here. Like when I'm talking to someone and people are standing here, I see them, but I see them as a sound, like here. And I hear everything. I can see it here and here and here. And it's like I'm seeing 360 degrees, but it's like sounds makes the rest of my vision here.
I do understand what you're trying to describe, and I understand it's a very difficult thing to explain these experiences. Could I also get you to disambiguate between what the green was and the orange? Because you've told me about this before, and it's quite interesting.
Yeah, because normally when I hear a saxophone, it's always kind of orange, yellow, gold, but then depends on who's playing it and what song it is. So I think the pink and the green is more the emotion of the person that what he puts into the music when he or she plays. So it adds a color to the sound.
So I'd just like to tell the audience that Nina has multiple forms of synesthesia. When she hears music, she not only has a colour for the timbre of the instrument, but she also has colour for emotion. So this might be the reactive emotion she has when hearing it. So the green is the emotion of the saxophone, whereas the orange is the sound or the timbre of the instrument. Nina, can you explain to us how you managed to get something which has a dimension of time, the song goes over time, and compress it into this nice 2D piece of art?
For me, it's like the memory sheet of the whole song. The sounds together is like, if I remember the song when they were playing and I think about it tomorrow, it would look like this in my head. And it's also like what kind of goes on and off. It's coming back and forth, all these kind of the same swirls and the same shapes. They're coming and going.
When you first hear the music, what's the most prominent? What colour jumps out at you when you initially hear the music?
Yellow and orange.
The yellow and orange?
I think depends how light it is. Depends.
Oh, tonight
was the yellow and white because they started very light, kind of, and then they went deeper.
Okay. Yeah. Now I'd like to open up the questions to anyone from the floor. Isabel's walking around with a mic. Does anyone have a question? Oh, we have one over here.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm just wondering to what extent the auditory component of the experience is for you reconstructible from the visual one. So suppose that you had just forgotten what the music sounds like. It's 25 years from now. And you look at this painting you just did this evening.
Yeah.
To what extent can you accurately reimagine the sonic experience that you had tonight from
Yes, I can, because I don't hear a sound when I see something, but I have sound effects for everything. So I can kind of, okay, that is that kind of sound. Yeah, I would definitely,
Okay.
yeah.
Wow, and part two of the question, do other people with synesthesia have a similar correlation? Would somebody else paint something that looks very similar? Have you ever encountered that before?
I
or is it
never
always unique?
thought about it, but
I actually have something interesting to say here. I've just asked Eliza down the front, who also happens to have music colour synesthesia, and although she said this is a beautiful painting, it just didn't match. It wasn't her colours. Do we have any other questions from the audience?
Hi. Do you ever find your synesthesia confusing in like a noisy place? Like, because I've got sound, color, shape as well, and I find that when I'm in a place that's very noisy, like a party, it gets very confusing.
yeah, I thought about it lately actually, because I didn't understand why sometimes I just feel like, and when it's really noisy, I can't hear what people say. And I think it's because I'm so confused by all the colors I see and like coming and going like this, and so I can't, like, because other people, they seem to be able to talk, but it's so noisy, so I can't hear the shapes of the words. I can't see the words. So it's like it's too much light. It's like when it's very bright light and it's just too light, so I can't see what they say. Yeah.
Now, I'm sorry, and I don't mean to be stingy with question and answer times. I saw a lot of hands go up there, but we're only going to have time for one more question now, and then Nina will be back later. Can we have the microphone down here for Eliza? Nina will be back in the question and answer panel, and can you ask any burning questions you have then, or in the intermission, which we're just about to have.
Is your painting for sale?
Yes, of course. It's for sale.
If you're interested in purchasing the painting, please come down after the event and we'll have it set up in the corner. The proceeds will go to the musicians and artists for tonight. Thank you very much, everyone. We'll be having a 15-minute interlude to rearrange the chairs, and then we'll come back for a couple of talks and then a question and answer panel. Thank you. Enjoy another glass of wine. Artists, Mr. Lachlan Pearce, Mr. Tony Gibson and Miss Nina Nova. That was a real treat. I don't want to stand in front of the painting. And thank you to all of those at the Power for supporting this event. It's been wonderful. Professor Mark Ledbury has shown an enthusiasm which has even outstripped mine. So that's quite amazing. Now, I'm sorry for the somber shift in tone, but I'd just like to take a minute to acknowledge someone who's very special to me. As some of you may know, my father, Dr. Michael David Berger, passed away just a bit over a month ago. He was a brilliant man who defied many years of illness and lived a life full of vitality. Without his support, and my sperm, he would declare, we would not be here today, because I would not be studying synesthesia. I would not have had these opportunities. So can everyone please raise their glass to Dr. Michael David Berger? Okay. Now, in the rest of the time, I'm just going to regale you with a short anecdote of how I came to study synesthesia. So, there once was a young girl with synesthesia. She so wished that mathematics was easier. The day she met Josh, I said, "Oh, by gosh, would a colourful calculator not please you?" Now, this pithy summation was spouted by Professor Watson, who's my supervisor, one day when we were trying to dream up titles for a paper. Although it's quite a good summary, I will expand for clarity's sake. Now, like a lot of good stories, this starts with a glass of red wine. I was spending an afternoon with my wife Nina and her friends at their apartment. Now, one of the friends was sitting on the floor on her computer compiling a playlist of music. And I noticed she had this funny look on her face. She just looked discontent. So I asked her, "What's up?" She sighed and looked at me and said, "You know, Josh, I'm going through a little bit of internal conflict." Then, with an air expectant of disbelief, she went on. She said, "When I see numbers, letters, and words, I always experience colour. It's weird. And because of that, not only does the music playlist have to sound right, think about your favourite album in the right order as opposed to out of order, but it has to look right. It has to have a visual aesthetic." "Oh, you've got synesthesia," I exclaimed. I went on to tell her that, yeah, I believed her, and that it was probably a hidden neurological trait. A trait just like having red hair or blonde hair, or being tall or short. Just hidden, like colour blindness. Did you know the former President Bill Clinton was colourblind? I certainly didn't. Now, she was shocked by this reaction. Her reports of synesthesia had only ever been met with dismissal, disbelief, or stigmatic diagnosis. And unsurprisingly, when someone explains or talks about synesthesia, this is a kind of reaction they have, or the reaction people have to that. Now, I'd like to take us down the rabbit hole a little bit further. One of the most interesting aspects of studying synesthesia and doing research in this field is the fact that it deals with the realms of the subjective, the intersubjective, and the objective. Now, because it is thought to be nearly impossible, or if not impossible, to directly verify somebody else's phenomenological experience, so synesthesia drives us to deep philosophical contemplation, very much like this address did back in 2015. Now, could I please have a quick show of hands who sees this as black and blue? Whoa, you're all weird. I see this as white and gold, and I can't see this anything but white and gold. If you're interested in why that is, please talk to one of the neuroscientists after. It's quite an interesting effect. Okay, I'm going to have to So we're getting back to the story now. So, I asked the friend, what was it like at school? What was the additional experience of colour which was automatic to seeing numbers and letters like? How did that influence you at school? She said subjects such as art and English had a natural flow. She had an affinity towards them because not only did they have a layer of meaning which we might all extract, they had an additional layer, perhaps a higher salience or an extra perceptual load contributed to this. She then went on to lament about mathematics. Why is it 3 by 4 equals 12? That's clearly wrong. I apologise to all the synesthetes in the audience. It's clearly green 3 by purple 4 equals orange 12. No one explained to her why that was, and no one acknowledged it. She said even to this day, she has trouble with mathematics, working behind tills or anything, and that's a big source of frustration for her. I then dwelled on for a moment on the subjective feeling of wrongness I presumed she might have. Kind of like reading coloured words in different colours. For example, yellow in blue, red in yellow, green in red, and blue in green. It's not as easy as it looks. And so, I reflexively asked her, oh, do you use colourful calculators? The simple intuition being, oh, matching must be better than mismatching. I hadn't thought about it any further than that. She responded that she hadn't, but that would be really nice to try. And so I turned to her and said, why don't we Google? I'm sure we can find one like that. No, I couldn't find it on Google, and this is what shocked me. I spent about an hour looking, nothing. We found calculators which could tell you the amount of red, green, and blue in a photo, but nothing where you could just change the colours for yourself. And I thought this was very strange, seeing as there has been synesthesia research done since about the 1900s, although it's been taken more seriously since about the 1990s. So, because we couldn't find one, I decided to design one. And with the help of a friend's father, we made a very basic one. It's just a basic Microsoft calculator where you can choose your own colours. Now, I didn't hear back from her for a couple of months, and I went back to med school and I forgot about it. I just thought it was of mild or novel interest to her. But then I received a very long emotive message. Okay, so I have been using the calculator you made me. It is brilliant, like completely brilliant. This week, I have been organising, lots of organising, around money basically, which just means heaps of maths. The calculator made it approximately 85% easier. It makes addition and subtraction understandable for the first time in my life. I cried the first time I used it. I think because after spending my entire life being told I had cognitive learning difficulties, when it came to maths, everything made sense. It was a great relief. It was actually quite life-changing. Now, I wasn't expecting such a big reaction, and this has actually spurred me to take some time off medical school and pursue this research further. Over the last 2 years, I've tested 53 other people with grapheme colour synesthesia, that's a form whereby you see numbers and letters and experience colour, on simple maths tests using colourful calculators in their colours and not in their colours, measuring their speed and accuracy as a proxy for function. Now, recently, the medical school has generously granted me an extra few years to continue studying this and upgrade this to a PhD. I'm hoping to take this in-lab study out of the lab and integrate it with platforms like Apple's Research Kit or Android's Research Stack and really upscale and improve the power and the scope of this study to see how simple, colourful tools may affect people's literacy and numeracy and learning. That is a story for another day. And I'm just going to say thank you once again to all of the wonderful people who have helped put on tonight. And before I leave, I'm just going to say one more thank you to my supervisors, Professor John Watson, Associate Professor Irina Harris, who couldn't join us today because she's enjoying a lovely holiday in North Italy, Dr. Karen Whittingham, who unfortunately had some car troubles today and couldn't make it up, and the wonderful Dr. Zoe Turpening, who is here in the audience as well. Before I leave, I'd just like to introduce our next speaker. Now, our next speaker is Associate Professor Anina Rich, and I don't want to do her a disservice by not mentioning the incredible amount of awards, grants, positions, and other incredibly prestigious things she holds, but you'll just have to trust me that they are as numerous as they are grand. Amongst the myriad of other things she does, being a mother, a scientist, a teacher, a researcher, a mentor, and an all-round amazing human being, she also runs the Synaesthesia research group at Macquarie University. And now she'll be giving us a talk titled The Science of Synaesthesia, Insights into Our Perceptions. Can I have a round of applause for Associate Professor Anina Rich? Thank you.
Am I standing in the right place, Josh? Is this the right spot? Awesome.
That's the right spot.
All right. Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you for inviting us to be part of this wonderful event. I think that the setup for the science is amazing. You've touched on all the things that I'm going to talk about, just from a slightly different perspective. So I would like to thank the Power Institute and Mark and Josh and Lisa Bell for putting this together and for inviting us to come and play. Those of you who have seen our little setup at the back, you might have experienced the rubber hand illusion. I have three wonderful PhD students with me tonight, so I'll introduce you to them as we go through. Okay, so I'm going to start with the big picture. How does conscious perception work? How do we see? How do we hear? Right now, your brains are being bombarded by a whole host of sensory information, more than you can possibly be aware of at any one time. And it has to select what's relevant, find what sensibly goes together, and integrate that to give you your conscious perception of the world. So we easily process complex visual scenes like this beautiful painting by Alice Fagrova, apparently effortlessly. And yet there's more detail in that than you can possibly be aware of at any one time. So even just within one single visual image, let alone all the sensory information that's going into your brain right now. So you can start to get a sense of the challenge. Right now, you're integrating the sound of my voice with my lips moving, and that aids your perception of what I'm saying, especially if I remember not to talk too fast. These require complex processes. You've got to integrate information across different regions of the brain, things that come in at slightly different times. And it relies on something that we know little about at the present, the way that the different parts of the brain coordinate and identify related information, and the way that you manage to incorporate what's coming in the context of your experience and your knowledge about the world already. Perception is not a single flow system. We know that we actually predict a lot of what's going on around us. And our perception is an integration of that information. Synesthesia is a phenomenon in which there's unusual integration. And so tonight I'll talk about the science of synesthesia and the way that this fascinating phenomenon might tell us more about conscious perception in general. So we've had some lovely examples of what synesthesia might be. I'm going to give you the slightly less exciting, perhaps, but more scientific definition. And that is that it's perception of a specific stimulus, so that might be a sound or a letter, that induces a concurrent, so at the same time, but distinct experience in a separate modality, so say sound to colour, or within the same modality. So for example, the most common version is, as Josh just mentioned, where people have colours for letters and numbers, words and so on. Now the prevalence of synesthesia, the estimates vary actually quite widely, from about 0.5% to maybe 4% of the general population. And that's because it depends really on how you define synesthesia, which form you're talking about, and how you measure it. And because lots of people don't actually know they have synesthesia. So either it might be a case like Josh's friend, who had experienced ridicule and people not believing her, in which case many synesthetes keep it a secret for a long time. Or it could be that they just thought everybody saw the world in that way. Because imagine, if you have a blue Tuesday, why would you go talking about it with people? You just know that Tuesday is blue. Apologies to synesthetes who don't have a blue Tuesday. There does seem to be, in the literature, a gender bias, but we have to be a little bit careful about this. There seem to be more women with synesthesia than men, but women are also more likely to approach a research group. So we essentially have a self-selected sample most of the time. So there may be more females with synesthesia than males. But there certainly is evidence that there's a genetic predisposition. There's a higher prevalence of synesthesia among biological relatives. And perhaps most importantly is that for most people it's not a disorder. As we've heard, there are some situations where people find it an interfering phenomenon, but most people describe it as, if anything, an unusual gift. Now, there are many forms of synesthesia, and many synesthetes have multiple forms. And it was lovely to hear Nina describing her experiences and the multiple types of synesthesia. In my lab, we study 4 forms of synesthesia primarily. In grapheme colour synesthesia, as we talked about, there's these vivid, consistent colours for letters and numbers. And so a grapheme colour synesthete might say something like, as a child, I can remember puzzling over why not everyone knew that 4 was red. And this illustrates that synesthesia is typically something that people experience for as long as they can remember, back into childhood. Another of my synesthetes says, well, when I'm reading, I can see that what I'm looking at is in black and white, but I also see the correct colours for the letters and symbols. And this quote illustrates the fact that it doesn't interfere with vision. It's not the same as perceiving 2 colours that appear to be out there in the world, that's a discussion for another day, at the same time. It's tagged differently. A synesthetic colour doesn't interfere with vision. Okay. We also study auditory visual synesthesia, and this is an example of a response that somebody has in response to the middle C on the piano. So one of my auditory visual synesthetes says, every sound has a colour. People hitting golf balls at the driving range. Each of their shots produces a slightly different shade of colour. Another says, I can't stand loud music. There are too many colours. And you can see that these sort of chime in with what Nina was describing earlier. If you think you might have auditory visual synesthesia, we've got some sounds in the back and some coloured pencils if you want to have your own turn at trying to create your synesthesia on paper. We also study olfactory visual synesthesia. And this is where smells evoke visual experiences. And you might have already noticed that although all of these involve colour, the complexity is almost hierarchical. So most people who have olfactory synesthesia also have auditory visual and grapheme colour synesthesia. So we tend to see these multiple forms as we get more complex. So one of my olfactory synesthetes says, butter is brown. Most dog smells are yellow or black. The smell of smoke is red, but cigarette smoke is blue. More recently, we've been starting to explore mirror touch synesthesia. And Sophie's here, who's starting her master's research on this project. We also have the rubber hand illusion set up there, which everybody can try, and maybe you can test yourself for mirror touch synesthesia as well. It's a type of synesthesia where seeing someone being touched results in a perception of touch. So what's going on in synesthetes? There are essentially 2 major categories of theories, and they postulate that synesthetes are different from non-synesthetes, either in a categorical way. So this argument says, well, historically people have assumed that there's hardwired extra connections in the brains of synesthetes. And this implies that actually synesthetes have different mechanisms, or the underlying brain architecture might be different. So for example, if we look in this nice little model of the brain, your brain doesn't really look like that, by the way, but here we have the front and the back. This is the cerebellum at the bottom, the little cauliflower. And here I've chopped it in half so you can see the middle bit, because then you can see the visual areas more clearly. Now we know that you can localise areas of the brain that respond to different sensory stimuli. So for example, if I play you tones, somewhere here in your primary auditory cortex will be activated, whereas if I show you a nice coloured stimuli like this Mondrian, you're likely to have activity in V4, which is this orange bit here. It's actually a lot smaller than it's illustrated there. So it could be that synesthetes have additional connections between, say, the auditory cortex and the visual cortex that results in their experiences. And that's sort of been one of the major theories. More recently, however, though, people have been thinking about synesthesia in a dimensional way. So maybe synesthetes vary from non-synesthetes, not in fundamental brain architecture or the really categorically in the way they're using it, but instead they might have the same connections that are somehow a bit stronger, or perhaps less inhibited. So we all have these connections, but in most of us they have some neurotransmitters that are inhibiting them. Perhaps in synesthetes that's a little bit less. And this suggests that the synesthesia builds on mechanisms that we all share. The prediction from this type of theory suggests that we should be able to find similarities between synesthetes' experiences and what we all experience. Okay? So advances in brain imaging have allowed some progress in answering these questions, but there's still a lot of debate. So we are lucky in that we can use techniques such as magnetic resonance imaging to look at the structure of the brain. So this is a slice through the brain this way, in case you really wanted to know. Can you see the ears there? I can take you through the anatomy later. I'll move on. So some structural imaging studies have kind of suggested that maybe there are some additional connections, but of course that could, with the measurement tools we have available, that could just as easily be a dimensional approach, so it could just be a stronger connection. Okay, so these structural MRIs are unlikely to tell us anything other than that there are no massive differences. Any differences are really quite subtle, if they're there at all. But we can also use this lovely, big, very expensive machine to trace blood flow in the brain. And we know that regions of the brain that are involved in a task increase in blood flow. And you get a change in blood flow that you can measure with the magnetic field. This is called functional MRI. And so if you have a situation where there's a synesthete who's perceiving this black A as red and a non-synesthete who just sees a black A, you can start to see that there might be differences in the brain. And certainly there are studies that claim that when they do this sort of contrast that they get activity in V4, that region I told you was active during colour perception. But unfortunately the results are very mixed and those studies aren't very strong. So there are functional differences when we look at synesthetes in using scanning techniques that show us that something different is going on in the brain, but it's nowhere near as clear cut as just being that the colour area is involved. So there's a lot more work to do. At this point, any differences are subtle and it's still a matter of very active debate and research. Okay, so why would I spend all this time studying synesthesia? I've just told you it's not a medical disorder to be cured, and hopefully the fact you're here suggests that you already find it interesting in and of itself. But you're not going to have someone turning up at emergency saying, I've got synesthesia, my chest is turning green and it sounds like the number 6. So why might we care enough to invest all this money and energy into studying it? Well, synesthesia is fascinating in and of itself. There's a small proportion of the population that see the world quite differently. And that illustrates the inherent subjectivity of perception. I can never verify that what I see is the same as what you see. We can compare it using language, but I can never be sure. So synesthesia is a really nice example of that. But my major motivation is not just to understand synesthesia. It's for the potential it has to provide unique insights into studying cognition in general. So something that's relevant for all of us. And that really requires synesthesia to be the dimensional approach, that it's going to inform me about mechanisms that we all share. Now, in particular, my research does support this notion of a dimensional approach to synesthesia. And so we've been exploring how synesthesia relates to other forms of integration, where you're integrating knowledge with incoming sensory information. I'll tell you more about that later on. Okay, so given you're convinced now that we should study synesthesia, how do you go about it? There are essentially two approaches. One is the direct approach. I can ask you about your experiences. And this provides really rich, fascinating insights into what it might be like to be a synesthete. But as you may have noticed when Nina was trying to describe what it is she actually sees, it's really difficult to use language. Imagine trying to describe the colour red to someone who can't perceive red. What it can do, although it can't tell us about how synesthesia occurs, it gives us clues for further testing. And then we can use our indirect measures, where we try to look for an objective measure of the phenomenon. And that essentially is looking at the effect of synesthesia on some other task. This then has the opportunity to tell us more about those underlying mechanisms. So we've been using both methods to study synesthesia for a number of years. We can use subjective reports not just to find out what it might be like to be a synesthete, but we can derive certain measures from it that can tell us more about the phenomenon. So I'm going to tell you about a few classic findings now. Synesthetic reports tend to be consistent over time. And one of the times that we showed that in a large sample was one of my first studies in synesthesia, was we just got 152 synesthetes to give us their colours for each of the letters of the alphabet, numbers, lots of different categories. And we also asked 48 non-synesthetic controls to do the same task, although for them it was essentially nonsensical. Associate a colour with the letter A. What? All right. Whereas for the synesthetes it makes absolutely perfect sense. We then sent a second version of the questionnaire 3 months later and looked at the consistency of the reports. If they said A is read the first time, was it also read the second time? And here I'm going to shock you with some data because I'm here as the scientist so I can, and you're all intelligent so you'll have no problem. Okay, I'm going to stop now. Turn to the graph. Here we have the percent consistency of reports over time from the first and the second questionnaire, and here we have the different categories. In the blue, I've got the synesthetes, and you can see that they're highly consistent. They are highly consistent over time, and I can compare that with the black bars, which are essentially our baseline, our non-synesthetic controls. So that's what we can expect from non-synesthetes. And so you can see that over a large group, synesthetes tend to be consistent over time, just as on an individual level they seem to be consistent. This holds for other forms of synesthesia, for auditory visual synesthesia, for mirror touch synesthesia. All the forms of synesthesia that we've studied tend to have this characteristic. Now that's not to say that it's completely consistent for every person. Some experiences do seem to change, but it's very hard to study those. It's very hard to study those experiences. So we do tend to be biased towards studying people who have consistent experiences. We can also use these subjective reports to look at whether or not there are any underlying patterns across synesthetes. So for example, here is the breakdown of some letters that seem to evoke certain colours more often than we would expect by chance. So A elicits a version of red, not the same red, but a version of red, for about 40% of synesthetes. B tends to be blue, D tends to be brown, and so on. What's particularly interesting is that from my non-synesthete group, we can see similar patterns. So 11 of the 13 consistent patterns that we see in synesthetes could also be seen in the control data. And what that suggests is that there are indeed commonalities across synesthetes and between synesthetes and non-synesthetes. Now this makes sense in a way. We're unlikely to be born with a blueprint for having a particular letter going with a particular colour, given we're not even born with a preprint for a particular language. Right? So it makes sense that there must be a common learning mechanism that fixes those particular associations. And in fact, even in cross-modal forms, we've got a good sense that says all of us have some implicit mappings between our senses. Can we, do I play the sound? Okay, this is audience participation if it plays. The sound isn't playing. It has to be high-pitched, please, like wind chimes. Not that one. Okay. So when we all listen to this, I would like you to put your hand up if you think this matches the black square better than the yellow square. Now I'd like you to put your hand up if you think it matches the yellow square. And what you'll see is that apart from one person, everybody agrees that the high-pitched tone goes with a lighter colour. Okay? Early work by people like Larry Marks and more recently by Charles Spence on implicit mappings in non-synesthetes has shown that there are many such mappings, not just between pitch and lightness, but between loudness and brightness, between almost anything you can think of. We've done it with smells and colour and texture with non-synesthetes. And what you see is that although we don't experience the same thing as synesthetes, we do have these mappings between the senses that can be systematic. Now, synesthetic experiences in response to sound can of course also be mapped. And so here is an example from one of our studies where we have two synesthetes who have represented their experiences in response to 3 different notes of increasing pitch. And what you can see is that the lower tones tend to be darker in colour, lower down in space and bigger in size than the higher tones. And Nina set this up beautifully for me when she said the brown of the trombone tends to be darker and it's down here, whereas the saxophone is much lighter and it's up here. So all of the features of Nina's wonderful painting are often present in our synesthetic mappings, and it's a beautiful illustration of how these sort of mappings go across. So although different synesthetes will say, well, the colours don't match or it doesn't match exactly, the likelihood is that they will also appreciate that the low colours are down low. And indeed, the non-synesthetes tend to appreciate that too. So if you look across a group, here we just have the size of the image that they illustrated as pitch increases. You can see that there's a nice decrease in size as pitch increases, and down the bottom we've got the increase in brightness of the colour as the pitch increases. So the higher the pitch, the lighter the colour. So again, this suggests that in auditory visual synesthesia, we've got evidence that there are similarities between synesthetes and non-synesthetes when you start to look at what underlies the specific experience. So cross-modal forms of synesthesia can tell us more about the way information is mapped across the senses. Why is that important? I want you to imagine that you're a pilot and a warning alarm is going off. One of these dials is important. It would really help if the tone of that warning alarm kind of vaguely matched where it should be in space and how big it should be. The brightness of the light, the colour of the light. So even in designing environments in our really complex day-to-day life, 10 milliseconds might be the magnitude of the effect. That's really tiny, but in a life and death situation, that could well make the difference between crashing the plane. So my student Sophie is working on a project where we're looking at whether subtle versions of mirror touch synesthesia can be seen in non-synesthetes. And I predict again that we will see this pattern where things that synesthetes have conscious experiences of, the rest of us have some implicit effects that we can document. She will also be looking at mirror touch synesthesia, so there's lots to do there. Okay, so I've told you a bit about what we can get from the direct measures. Let's have a quick look at the indirect measures that might tell us more about the mechanisms. And this is a bit of audience participation. I want you to just name the colours as they appear out loud so everybody can hear you. Are you ready? As fast as you can. Go. Green. That was going to keep going. Okay. Ooh, there's been a bit of wine over there. That was a bit slow. Okay, now we're going to do the same thing again. And again, Josh set this up beautifully. I don't want you to read the word. I want you to name the colour. Are you ready? Go. No, it's not yellow. It's not yellow. And that's not the effect of wine, or maybe wine as well. You've just experienced the classic Stroop effect. If you've ever done undergraduate psychology, you knew about it already. Essentially, you will have experienced that it was much more effortful to name the ink colour when it didn't match the word. And typically, if I'd measured your colour naming times, your results would look something like this. Oh, no, they wouldn't. Where your neutral or congruent colour naming times would be much faster than in the incongruent condition. And the typical story goes like this. Word reading in literate adults is highly automatic and involuntary, and so you can't stop yourself from reading the word, and it interferes with the slower process of colour naming. Now, synesthesia is argued to be involuntary. Synesthetes don't sit around going, ooh, I wonder if A is red, right? It's an involuntary experience when they see the particular letter. So it holds then that if synesthesia is involuntary, we should be able to get a measure of it using the same sort of logic. So here's a set of items that I put together for one of my synesthetes. She has A as red, S as white, and so on. And so I can make a nice congruent stimulus where A is presented in her version of red. Okay, and we try and match that nicely. But then, of course, it's not all nice because I'm then going to mix them up and I'm going to give her a yellow A and a red S and a white T. And for those of you who have grapheme colour synesthesia, you're probably wincing because most of that will be incongruent. The idea is that if you can't stop your synesthesia, then here you should be getting a synesthetic red, but you're trying to say yellow, okay? So if synesthesia is involuntary, display colour naming times should be affected by the letter or number, okay? So you get to try again. Now I want you to name the colour as quickly as you can, okay? Okay, now if you were a synesthete, that probably sucked and hopefully it was fine for everybody else. If we then look at my example synesthete here, for whom A is red, a reminder, this is the congruent stimulus and the incongruent stimulus, and the task is just to name the display colour. It's actually nothing to do with synesthesia. Your only task is to name that colour as quickly as possible. If I get a non-synesthete to do that, you can see here are their colour naming times and they don't differ between the conditions as you'd expect. But for synesthetes, we find a big difference. So this is the result actually of my honours work in '99, where we did the first group study of synesthesia, and we found that this robust congruency effect, where synesthetes were significantly slower in the incongruent condition than the congruent condition. And what this shows us is that synesthetic colours are involuntary. You can't stop them even if there's actually a really good reason why you'd want to. And we can use this then as an index of synesthesia. So we can start to look at how is it manipulated with attention and other forms of manipulation. And we've done that quite a lot. So to summarise that bit then, synesthetic images are consistent and involuntary. Synesthetes can't prevent them from occurring, and I didn't tell you about it, but it turns out that you have to be attending to the letter for that to work. These visual synesthetic images, much like the painting behind me, contains much more than just colour. It's got form, it's got texture, it's got location. Often for auditory visual synesthesia, it's got motion. And synesthetic congruency effects can give us an objective measure of these experiences. Now, I mentioned earlier that our research suggests that synesthesia might be informative about how we can integrate processing incoming information with our knowledge about the world. And we all have knowledge that really influences what you end up seeing. So, for example, if I show you a grayscale image of a tomato, it activates all sorts of associated information. The name of the object, its common colour, how it tastes, smells, and so on. And for some people, the strong colour association might even result in the grey tomato appearing a little bit red. My student Lena has recently used a technique called MEG, or magnoencephalography. It records brain activity with excellent timing resolution. And what she's done is she's shown that non-synesthetes, looking at images like this, actually have a pattern of brain activity that's similar to that when we actually see colour. Just occurs a bit later in time. So what this provides is evidence of an underlying mechanism for linking incoming sensory information with our experience and knowledge to create our conscious perception. Synesthesia seems to be another type of this bound information. So for a synesthete, the letter A is not just an A, the first letter of apple or the first letter of the alphabet, but also has a colour. And I'm really sorry, because 40% of people see that A is red. I use that as my example a lot. If your A isn't red, you've been wincing the whole way through. We're currently doing research on associative learning in synesthetes and non-synesthetes with my PhD student Marguerite here, and brain imaging using both MEG, as I mentioned, but also fMRI, and that's the work that Lena's doing, to look at how synesthesia relates to this important feature of the way that we bind information together, what's coming in with what you know about the world, and how we make those associations. So overall then, all of these forms of synesthesia and the whole host of synesthesia research going on across the world tells us that synesthesia tends to be consistent and involuntary. We can objectively measure synesthetic experience. It's actually just like all other perception research. If you go into the lab and I'm looking at contrast sensitivity, it's still a subjective perception, and we have the tools that allow us to study it. And synesthesia, we argue, builds on mechanisms that we all share, and it can therefore inform us about a lot of different issues. So the way we integrate information into perception of a cohesive object is a combination of that input, what's present in the world, and what we already know. Synesthesia presents a situation where that internal knowledge is something beyond typical experience, which gives a richness to the representation of that sensory input that many of us wish we had. So it may be useful in understanding how we represent all the different attributes of objects, both sensory and not, and in enhancing our design of environments where information is presented in different sensory modalities, and that's critical. It could enhance your perception, your appreciation of that glass of wine, and maybe even understand the basis of empathy. I would like to acknowledge the wonderful students who come from actually all over the world and work together with me on this. Also my past student who's graduated and is currently on a postdoc, and my other collaborators. And most of all, actually, all the wonderful participants, both synesthetes and non-synesthetes, for whom the tasks are really meaningless, who come and generously give us their time so that we can conduct this research. And thank you all for listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anina. And I'm now going to invite... Whoop, hold on a minute. Okay, can you hear me? Yes, now you can, definitely. So I'm now going to invite Nina and Josh back up, and we're going to take a Q&A, which can be as speculative as you wish. Ask us any questions. You may have a hard science question for Anina. You may have a larger cultural question. Just have a question. We've plied you with enough wine that your inhibitions are now firmly got over. So now just raise your hands. Someone will come with a mic, and please ask a nice, succinct, short question, to which we will give a long and rambling answer. But your job is to put a very short question to us. Thank you.
I think this one's yours.
You got one, Nina?
I do.
Wait for the mic.
Yeah.
No. You might have to project.
Yep. Now
that's good.
Now it's on. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds to me like there are some legal implications with synesthesia. Could be. If I went through a red light and argued in court, no, it wasn't red, it was green. I definitely saw green. Would that be a mitigating circumstance?
I can answer that, no. There's no evidence that synesthesia interferes in your vision in any way. We've done low-level colour tests that show that synesthesia doesn't show the same features as colour perception. So you wouldn't have a chance. Oh. Well, at least not if they called me.
I'm not a synesthetic, so I won't have that problem. But there is another one more.
So the colourblind, of course, have a big problem when the order of the traffic lights is reversed. In other words, they gauge the traffic lights from where they are in the position of rather than the actual colour itself. And so that people have challenged parking.
Oh, they have?
Yes, but not through synesthesia, through colour blindness. Anyway.
There's another one, if I may, just very quickly. In architecture, we learned about the colour wheel. It's one of the basic things that you learn. And you learn that if you add a little bit of red to blue, you get purple. If you add a little bit of yellow to blue, you get green. And so you work your way around the colour wheel. I would imagine for a synesthetic, you would have to reinvent the whole wheel, wouldn't you?
No.
You don't?
No, it's the same. The color works the same in the brain. Like you see on the painting, for example, when the orange, like the sound of the darker red goes up to orange, to yellow, up to more white, and it's not different to how it works in the real. The colors work the same way.
If I might interject, it does sometimes play a bit of confusion if you're adding colours of numbers. So as my friend was experienced, why should a blue 3 or a green 3 times a purple 4 equal orange 12? It's not like the colour wheel.
Like one time I heard my teacher reading a book in school, and I always perceived the piano notes similar, like in red, shades of red up to yellow and white. And the book was talking about listen to the green sound of the piano, and I was just like, this is really wrong. Like, why? Like, I couldn't understand how can they talk about green piano notes. It's like saying that I have a like I'm wearing something pink now and I'm wearing black.
And that's that experience of incongruence which both Anina and I spoke about, just like everyone has with the colour words if they're coloured wrong.
Yep.
Plenty of questions. Yes, go ahead.
So I have number to colour synesthesia, and I was talking to my cousin about this, and she mentioned that she has one association, that 9 is green, and that is the same association that I have, although I have all the other numbers too. I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit about how mappings from colours to numbers tend to clump together like that. Like, is there any common things, like you were saying, A is red? Is there any research on that kind of phenomenon?
There is, and there's a number of different factors that seem to influence how particular colours and letters go together, but it's by no means complete. I mean, even though A tends to be red, that's only for 40% of synesthetes, right? So there's a systematic pattern that's more than we'd expect by chance, which tells us that there's, you know, some common learning experience somewhere, like 60% of non-synesthetes say the same thing, right? But it's not a complete explanation. For letters that start colour words, so for instance, R tends to be red, even for synesthetes for whom other R words might not be red. But it tends to flavour it. And so there are various theories about, you know, letter shape might contribute for these letters, and, you know, maybe semantics are for the colour words, but it's essentially, it's an ad hoc, a post hoc explanation. I couldn't predict on the basis of those what someone's individual colours would be. And so it's not by any means a complete explanation. Josh, do you have anything to add to that?
There was one interesting study done in, I think, the States, where they showed a number of people had the same mappings and they all grew up with the same Fisher-Paykel fridge magnets.
There's one study, yeah.
I also know some of my participants, when reflecting on it, have realised my colours are the same as Sesame Street, or if not the current Sesame Street, the old Sesame Street, which they used to watch. So, as Anina talked about before, synesthesia, or I was saying, it's a trait. It's a combination of your genetics and your interaction with the environment. So there is a learning component. So if there's something which is culturally transmitted, such as the Bauhaus interactions between shape and colour, that might influence it. However, the individual differences between synesthetes are still greater than the similarities.
Mm. And actually, there are also people who, like one of my synesthetes says, she was trying to work out how early she was experiencing synesthesia. And she said, those fridge magnets, I could never work out why they put an M in blue. So, you know, like there's some cases where you go, oh, that's a really clear mapping. But I spent a long time in the State Library of Victoria looking at all the children's books that were published during the period that my synesthetes in that 150 sample study would have been reading books, searching for something sensible, and I didn't find it. Predominantly printing for most of them was single colour wash at that point. So you see some things like A's tend to be represented with apples, right? And so there's some things that you go, oh, that's probably where it comes from. But it doesn't account for all of them.
Lots of other questions. Let's try and whip round quickly. A couple at the front here, Isabel, one you've done with those ones there.
Josh, I actually have a question for you. So I really liked your idea of like having the calculators. I was just wondering whether, did you just have every digit in a specific color, or what happened if you, for example, put then 6 times 2 equals 12? Is then the 12 just the color of 1 and 2, or is it one color for both?
So for the initial calculator I made, it was every digit had their own colour. And the first bit of feedback I got from my friend was 72 has its own colour for some reason. And so I said, okay, back to the drawing board, we've got to make an option for custom numbers. But then when I started testing more people, oh, these ones have more of a kind of, it's like a sunset, so it's like retouched over all the colours. Or this has some shapes and patterns in it as well. So that became too difficult, particularly for studying. But the hope is one day that for the individual colours on the tool, they can have their own colours. Perhaps that will either come up in multicolour or black. It's kind of to be seen. Just to extend on that a little bit further, if a number has a particular emotional valence, say you're born on the 12th of January, the number 12 might have its own colour. It seems, at least to me, and I've read in a bit of the literature, that there does seem to be an affective or emotional or kind of value component to synesthesia. So if something has a high value, it might take on its own colour. Another example of that is people who learn new languages. Initially, the words might be all in the colours, individual colours of the letters. But once they learn the pronunciation, the phonemic sound of it, it might gain its own colour. Or if it has an emotional or semantic meaning, like a specific meaning of knowledge, it might gain another colour. So it's very complex, but I do hope to one day find those nuances and help people express that on their tools.
I forgot my question.
What colour was it, Eliza? You don't know?
So I'm just curious. I've met Nina recently, and we do a very similar thing in different ways. So, like, everything you guys have said is extremely interesting, but it's in a very scientific perspective, and science always tries to dissect things to this greatest level, and it takes us out of the whole reason why we're looking at all of this. And I'm just curious, from not outside of this room, like we'll just stay here, and your own personal insights, maybe that you wouldn't share with your scientific colleagues, everything that you've learned or that you've seen today or that you've discussed, what insights do you have about like human consciousness and a greater scale? Like, what are we besides our brain and our grey matter? Like, what are your personal perceptions or opinions, if I can ask that personal question?
Is this of me?
No,
yeah,
was I directly?
It's for you.
Excellent. Okay.
Sorry,
Excellent question. Josh, you want to go first?
There are two males, and I tend to look at the male department. But yes, all of you, I'm just interested from all your different perspectives. You know, not on a dissecting scale, but on a greater scale. You know, and what this means for everyone.
So, Josh, given that she said that the males should answer that, can I go first?
Yes. Yeah, go for it, Nina.
It tells us, it reminds us about the inherent subjectivity of perception. So, yes, I try and dissect it, and yes, I'm going to try and control as much as I can, because then I can make inferences that make sense. But at the essence of it, what it means is that I'm reminded that when you look at the same thing as me, I can never, ever be sure that we are seeing and experiencing the same thing. And that's true whether you're a synesthete or not, but we forget it. And that means that when we're both reacting to an event in the world, or we're reacting to something that challenges our social hierarchy, look at the location where we are now. A lot of really full-on things have happened around here. And my understanding of the world is completely flavoured by my experience and my knowledge, and so is yours. And by understanding and reminding ourselves of the inherent nature of the inherently subjective nature of perception, and the fact that my knowledge is completely shaping what I see and experience as incoming, is crucially important. Now you can answer.
That was a brilliant answer. I'm not sure I can add too much to that, other than the stick figure diagram I showed during my talk. This is the reason why I love studying synesthesia. It's really difficult, and it's left me in the fetal position a few times. But dealing with the realms of the subjective, the intersubjective, what we can agree on, and then the objective, it's one of the central questions of philosophy. And I'm sure everyone's kind of thought, how do I know I see the same red as you, or do I see the same red as you? And that's a question which people are arguing, yes, there is a solution to it, some sort of algorithmic solution that, yes, we will be able to peer in and that problem will disappear. And then there's others who state very firmly that this is beyond our analysis of it. It's a truly hard or impossible problem. And that's, I think, one of the most exciting areas which we can learn a lot about from studying synesthesia.
Can I just add a small amount to this? I think it's really important to learn from minorities, exceptions, places that we think are on the edge of what we would understand as normality, and that we can actually actively benefit, all of us, from, in a way this was Oliver Sacks' great sort of roll of the dice into our culture was that things that were regarded as marginal, weird, and incredibly exceptional had something to tell us about the condition of what it's like to be a human being. And I think that, you can say the whole of art history is a weird history of exceptionalism. It's kind of an odd history of weirdos and people who did strange things at strange times and who said, you know what, I see the world like this and not like this. And I firmly believe that we have a lot to learn from that oblique angle on things. And synesthesia might have lots to tell us on an objective level. It also, I believe that an enormous amount of the creative spurt of maybe 150 years has been based on the hunches and oddnesses and quirkinesses of a generation that said, you know what, I see things a slightly different way. And because I see things a slightly different way, I think the world looks like this to me. And we might want to, aside from all the brilliant science that's being, we might need to culturally take advantage of this exceptionalism, of this strangeness, and just see ourselves differently for a while, because it is incredibly useful for our empathy, for our understanding of the way that other people see things, from our understanding of the entire world, to take that point of view. I think that synesthesia is a small pointer to a much larger and important human phenomenon that if you like, is called exceptionalism, which helps us defeat cliché and doxa and uniformity and the kind of, I'm sorry to say it, BS that dominates the way we sort of make easy assumptions about stuff. That, to me, is one of the, Rimbaud might have been a disgusting guy who left turds for his friends and stuff, but he was somebody who pricked a kind of consciousness, who said, no, you know what? You don't have to see it that way. And synesthesia may not be utterly about that, but the people that I know, from Olivier Messiaen to Duke Ellington to Wassily Kandinsky, all had a very important role in shaking people out of a set of easy correspondences and beliefs and everything. And that is important. That's why a humanities approach to this kind of phenomenon is as important as a scientific approach. That's what it is. Have you remembered your question? Yeah. Oh yeah, we've got one there. Come on.
Sorry. So are there situations in which someone with synesthesia can be induced to have no synesthesia, or in someone who is a non-synesthete develop synesthesia, and both either temporarily or permanently through medications or drugs or tumours, strokes, whatever it might be, brain insults that either make someone who is not a synesthetic and vice versa?
So there are a couple of studies from Roy Cohen-Kadosh's group where they've used hypnosis. So they've hypnotised a non-synesthete to associate certain letters with colours and then shown that they can get the type of Stroop effects that I was presenting. Equally, you can hypnotise a non-synesthete, synesthete, I would assume, to behave like a non-synesthete. The issue with that is you never know whether it's the same mechanism. So if you wanted to just experience being a synesthete, then it would be absolutely fine. You could be hypnotised, and you could get the post-hypnotic suggestion that you've got a link between these letters and colours, and then perhaps you would start to experience them. But it's hard to know whether or not it's working on the same mechanism. There's also been a lot of reports of sort of that taking LSD or mescaline result in synesthesia-like experiences, but it's different. So it depends on the level of the drug in the system, it's very uncontrolled, and it's more like sounds giving weird visual patterns, apparently.
Allegedly.
So it's not the same as sort of developmental synesthesia. There are also a couple of, sorry? No, so they don't tend to be consistent in that situation. There are a few cases of people who have reported gaining synesthesia after a brain insult. I've met one of these gentlemen in the States, and he has a very specific story about getting tastes for colours after having a head injury. But it's always extremely difficult because you have no documentation beforehand. So you're restricted to studying what the person's experiencing now. And I guess the other relevant thing is that people often report that they had something like this when they were smaller, when they were younger, and that either the colours faded. They can still remember them, but they don't see them anymore. This sort of thing. So that can be. So other people say it doesn't change at all with age, but for some people it kind of fades with age.
I'd just like to add a few things to that. I think synesthesia can be painted with several brushes. You can paint it more broadly as just the phenomena of having one sensory input triggering to a veridical perception, so the perception which would normally be attributed to it, plus a secondary one, and then you could say someone on LSD has had just an instance of synesthesia. Or you could have developmental synesthesia or trace synesthesia. You have the genetics which make you more likely to form these synesthetic connections, and then you've had the environment and the learning and you've solidified it, so you've got it as a trait. And more recently, there has been some reports of something called one-shot synesthesia, whereby people who have synesthesia will have an experience of synesthesia outside of their normal experiences. So say, well, Nina experiences everything, so I can't really use her as an example, but say someone who only experienced numbers and letters together, but never experienced any tastes. One day, and under a heavily emotional circumstance, they might start associating tastes with words, but these tend to be short in time and not consistent.
Can we get Eliza's question? I just remembered.
And then we'll go to...
When, like, a little while ago, for me, E was green, and I really didn't like that, but then it turned, like, a peachy colour, which I like. And my mum thinks maybe it's because of the colour of my room, because when I was little it used to be like a green colour, but then I repainted it and now it's sort of a pinky colour. Would that be why?
Perhaps you're at a wonderful stage of life where you're still growing in your brain, doing amazing things, pruning connections and making connections. So you're at a more malleable stage, a stage where things can change a little bit more. And Anina can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think it's about the age of 12, 13 when these associations are starting to become a bit more consistent.
I would say we don't have enough information yet.
I shouldn't speculate.
Studying synesthesia in kids is an amazing thing that we've been talking about doing. Well, I'm part of an international study where we're starting to kind of look at what are the patterns in kids. Do they change much more than in adults? What characteristics might go along with that? But we haven't actually even started data collection in Australia. I should get on that. I'll let you know next time.
I'm not sure I'll be able to phrase this very well, but I guess if we're talking about colour and sound synesthesia, we're talking about vibration, aren't we, and Hertz values. So in for want of a better word, normal brain, are there normal connections between the tonotopic map in the cochlea and the rods and cones in the retina? And if there are direct connections, would part of the problem in synesthesia be that those connections don't appear in, for want of a better word, a normal way? Can you understand what I'm saying?
I understand what you're saying. So the first thing to say is that all the robust evidence really suggests it's at a much higher level. So rods and cones are in the retina. We're nowhere near that. We're definitely cortical. So you process information from your rods and your cones, that triggers an action potential that goes through the system, through the thalamus, and ends up in your visual cortex at the back of the brain. Then the visual cortex essentially pushes it forward in a hierarchy of more complex processing. And so the V4 that I showed you that's involved in colour perception would be a really obvious candidate to see whether or not that is actually linked to the auditory cortex in synesthetes and not non-synesthetes. But it turns out that actually we've all got those sort of connections. So there are animal studies where they've done tracing studies and looked at auditory cortex links to visual cortex. There are studies with people who are blind who show that recruitment of the visual cortex starts to happen for listening to sounds. So the available cortex, the adult brain is actually still plastic. It's amazing. You have an injury and you start getting sort of compensation where you start using other strategies, or maybe you're starting to use other brain areas. And so it's not as simple as just saying that there's additional connections. I feel like there's no good evidence that synesthetes have fundamentally different brains from the rest of us. I think they're just using it a little bit differently.
And just on a cultural level, you know, the 18th century was, a few figures in the 18th century got very fascinated by whether you could map auditory and visual. So, you know, whether you could make a tone system for colours, whether, you know, and in fact, you know, the mad and fantastic Jesuit mathematician Castel, you know, who invented and sort of built an early prototype of a kind of colour harpsichord that would somehow translate sounds or map sounds onto a series of complex. He took his whole idea from like a sentence in Newton, in which he sort of threw away a footnote about, well, maybe there's something to do with the relationship between the colour spectrum and the tonal system. In other words, it has been a fascination for people to try to link ways of perceiving in kind of, to try to make mappings. But, you know, neuroscience is showing us otherwise. But in fact, that quest is kind of a deep human need, as if we're all trying at some level to link parts of what we do with other parts of what we do, or find equivalences or find correspondences that are satisfying and interesting on a human level, as if all of us want a theory of everything, but we can't quite get there. And that's kind of culturally an interesting fact.
I think we should probably take one more question and then let people have another drink before they leave.
I think this might be a question for Anina. Is it possible that mirror touch synesthesia is the result of hyperactive mirror neurons? Like if there's a lower threshold of activation for mirror neurons that might result in mirror touch synesthesia?
It's possible. Depends on whether or not you believe the evidence that there's a mirror neuron system in humans to start with. So mirror neurons are neurons that they've found in monkeys that respond not just when they see something moving in a particular way, but also when the monkey makes that movement themselves.
Anina, like monkey see, monkey do?
Yeah, only at the same time, and having the neuron care about both of those things. So particular neurons will activate not just when the monkey reaches for food, but also when it sees the experimenter reach for food. And people have done research in humans using fMRI where they've tried to say, okay, what about if we're observing an action and performing an action? And they've looked in the action-related areas in the brain to try and see whether or not we have a mirror neuron system. So if you think that those studies are solid, then it would be a reasonable hypothesis to say maybe this is the system that's hyperactive in synesthetes. But it's also true that all of us in our somatosensory system, so the regions of the brain that respond when you're being touched, have a sub-threshold, a lower threshold, but some activity when they see someone else being touched. And so an equally reasonable hypothesis doesn't necessarily invoke a mirror neuron system, but says what's happening is that that's below threshold for most people. And there is an imaging study with one case of mirror touch synesthesia that showed strong activity in the somatosensory cortex for the synesthete that was stronger than the controls that they tested. So that's also a possibility. So when Sophie's finished her mirror touch synesthesia masters, maybe she'll go on and do that for her PhD, and we can let you know.
On that rather large question, we may have to finish up the sort of official part of our proceedings. I would like to thank Anina and Nina and Josh and everyone, and Lachlan, Anthony, and everyone involved in the whole of this evening. I want to thank you for coming. I want to encourage you to have another glass of wine, buy a pizza, stay for a while, talk to us informally, ask us more questions if you'd like, and watch this space for more evenings like this at this location and others that Power and our scientific colleagues will think. But I want, first of all and most of all, to thank all our participants for this evening. Thank you very much.